Here is Pennonia Turkish Blue, and this is a bright blue with a bit of a turquoise lean that the swatch shows a red sheen, but I don't get that sheen in the writing sample. We will see a very consistent tone as paper changes, and we will also see that it does shade just a little bit, but in no way a standout quality of this ink. This is generally a good ink for students, as on many non-fountain pen friendly papers, the performance is well within an acceptable range. I would for sure enjoy a bottle of this. It's very cool as a temperature blue, a cool blue. This is bright and lively on the page.
The pen for today is a Sailor 1911 Standard. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
On the bright white paper, this is a very bright, standout, bold blue. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread. It does have some shading if you're following where I'm looking. Where the F is slightly darker, the aloin in the middle is a nice, fairly uniform tone. The G at the end does get much darker, though most of the writing that we tend to see looks like section, all one tone with the cross of the T being just slightly darker. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Pennonia makes more than just one ink. Let's take a look at a few other inks from Pennonia.
Here is Pennonia Bubblegum. Here is Pennonia Dungo Wasp.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade probably about as well as it does on the Clairfontaine. Not its standout feature. Really, it is a beautiful, bold blue. You here get to see that slight bit of a turquoise lean to it. I think a little bit better than you did on the bright white. This being just a flatter tone of paper, I think makes it easier to see. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here we see the tone is just a bit lighter than we had on the Clairfontaine. Also, this paper is really bringing out that turquoise lean. I believe this to be a little bit more of a translucent ink being affected by the tone of this paper, not in a bad way, just that it is affecting it. Now, otherwise, it doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does not shade like it did on the other papers, meaning it's harder to find here than it was on other papers. But it is still slightly present. Just take a look at not on the third line where the no is lighter than the T at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we have no problem for ghosting. We have a lot of spots that it got very deep into the paper. Now, none of it bled through to touch the page underneath, but I do still think because of the tone of the ink with this paper, you could probably write on both sides without corrupting your notes.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does have moments of shading. I mean, you can see it in Cartesian, but it's nowhere near as easy to find as it was on the Clairfontaine, though it is still present. Most importantly, it stands out against the quad rule with no problems at all, allowing that to melt into the background and the important notes to be easily read. Looking at the back of the page, we have no bleeding, no ghosting, only a couple of spots that it got a little deeper into the page, nothing that would stop you from writing back here.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more blue inks that are out there.
Here is Diamine Kensington Blue. Here is Krishna Silent Night Sky. Here is Noodler's Blue Steel. Here is Pen BBS number 182 April Diamond.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here, the tone is just a little bit lighter and flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine, not as lively a blue, also looking much more as a turquoise, very blue leaning. Though I said they're the same tone, it's that it's so slight, you barely see it. It like right now, when they're not directly side by side, I don't see it. It was only the very exact moment of them being side by side, but even still, the tone is incredibly close. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does shade, not as well as on the Clairfontaine, but it does shade. Take a look at relations on the third line. It stands out against the quad rule with no problem. It shows itself to be a great ink for a student to use in these notebooks. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Sailor Studio 131.
Here is Krishna Orange. Here is Sailor Kobe number 6 Bordeaux. Here is Sailor Kobe number 21.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here the tone is only very slightly lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. There are some tiny moments of feathering, not really worth the attention. They're there, but not worth having to say I'm not using this ink on this paper. The amount of spread that we encounter is less than the normal amount of spread that I tend to see on copy paper. It does have a couple of moments of shading that do occur, but with some of the shading can come a little bit of the feathering, like either is a little bit darker a word and it has tiny feathers on it. Looking at the back of the page, you see there's no real problem for ghosting. The problem is the ink penetration into the page. I would not write on the back of this page with this ink for fear of losing the notes, but I don't think this is horrible to use on this paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The wet music nib in the Sailor 1911 Standard gives a lively and bright blue with a slight turquoise lean. It can shade, but don't count on a lot of it. Off camera, I tried this in a medium flow, medium nib, and it did not disappoint. It kept a bright, lively blue, but that turquoise lean was a little bit more obvious. Now, turquoise usually isn't my thing, but the increase in the turquoise lean from the medium flow, medium pen really set this ink off as even more. So go for a medium flow, medium nib.